Good evening, ThinkScript scholars. I'm Clarence Carr, and tonight we're going to do an additional video about the use of ThinkScript, and I thought it might be helpful to learn how to reference other studies and use them in your study. And the study I've chosen to reference is the market forecast, and we're going to do a study that looks at the prices associated with the peak and trough of the near-term line on this study. A lot of people feel like these are valid support and resistance areas, so that's why we're going to do this study, and I think it will be instructive in the meantime. So here I have my chart of the SPY set up, and at the bottom I have my version of the market forecast. I like to put the dots on the blue line so I can count to see whether it's been 7 to 12 days above the 50th percentile. As you know, David often says that it needs to stay up there for that period. And of course, I'm talking about David Settle at marketscholars.com. So what we're going to do is set up this study, and I've got this study written separately, and I'm just going to copy sections of it over as we talk about it. We're going to clean this up to start with here. As always, this brings up this new study by default and counts depending on how many you haven't cleaned up. I've got a few out there apparently I haven't cleaned up. So we did talk a little bit in the last video about how I like to do a header, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that today. So I'm going to bring my header in here, and this is a little bit more how I often have my headers. You'll notice that I also have a little bit of a complex name in here. I have found that when I'm writing a lot of code, I have various revisions, and if they're all named the same thing, it's very difficult to keep track of what changes I've made where. So I tend to put in, first of all, my initials, and then an underscore, followed by the year, month, and day that I actually wrote the study. And then I will have another underscore and actually name the study. I've also found that sometimes I really want to know what this study is when I'm looking at the chart so I can go, oh, that's not my latest version. And because of that, I will have these two lines. So input name, you have to do text. If you're going to have text like this, you have to put it in an input statement, even though you really don't want to change it later on. But it's the only way you can really input a text string like this unless you hard code it into the label, which would be another option here. We could just take this piece of code right here, or that little text, I should say, and we could just copy it down here where it says name, and you would have the same effect. So that's certainly another way you could do this. I then have the input statement for show label, and I use this true or false value here to decide whether I want to show the label or not, because of course sometimes I may not want to. We're going to keep it at yes right now, just for fun. So I can demonstrate this really. Then I have this little disclaimer I like to put in just in case somebody else is using my software and decides they don't like it, or there was a mistake in it, or something along that line. And I'm going to bring over the next statement is to declare where we want this to show up. And we want this study to show up on the upper price graph, not on one of the lower subsections or windows. Now, the other thing I'm going to do, which is completely optional, is just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to put in a red, green, blue numbers as input statements so that you can, or the user could change these later. This will be basically just to reference some of the colors in our study. And as you probably know, RGB, you have the three variables or parameters that you pass to the color statement, and this will set your color based on numbers from 0 to, I believe it's 255, so with all zeros being black and all being 255 as a white color. So we're going to next define a global color, which will involve or reference these numbers. I have to just give me 1 second here. I have to just do a slight edit off screen here so I can do this right. There we go. So now what we're going to do is have a global color that we're going to call study color, and we're going to create that color based on these values that are put in here. Now we're going to reference another study. The study that we want to reference is the market forecast study, and we're particularly interested in the near-term plot of that. So how that is done is with this line right here. Plot near-term equals reference market forecast. You have to include the parentheses, period, and then which of the plots within that study you want to reference. I should note that this is completely optional to put the reference term in there. You can delete that and have exactly the same result. Now, we don't really want to show the near-term line on this study, so we're going to place, say, near-term period, hide parentheses. The reason you have to do this is you can't just make this a definition when you're referencing another study. So you have to do that as a plot, but then you can hide that plot so it doesn't actually show. Now, what we want to do with the near-term line, first of all, is to find the peak. And we're going to define the peak in this manner. Define peak equals if the near-term line is greater than 20 and the near-term line currently is greater than the near-term line value one candle ago. Remember, in these studies, when ThinkScript executes, it always starts at the left side of the chart and moves across to the right side of the chart. And this indexing that we've talked about a little bit is a method to see what the prior candle or bar's value was for comparison or for setting your current value. Now, the reason I've included the near term greater than 20 is that in general, when I've heard this talked about in the past, and I will say that Blake Young, who was previously at InvestTools, had talked about this a fair amount, and certainly he always preferred to have the near-term line out of the reversal zones when he was using it for support and resistance. So I've set this to be greater than 20. I've said that the near-term line has to be greater than the prior near term, and the near term has to be greater than the next. So what we're finding here is the peak. So you can understand that the prior bar, let's say, would be here, this bar would be here, and the next bar would be down here again. So that's what this logic here tells us. And then we take the close at that peak, and see what the closing price is, or else it's a null value. Double, not a double NaN, which is means not a number. So now the next step is to be able to carry this forward so that we know after the peak occurs when the last peak was. So we're going to find and hold the last valid peak price data. So define the last peak equals to if this number was in fact a number 1 bar ago, then carry that number forward. Else, carry this number forward. So in other words, if you've just had a new peak in the prior candle here, then you're going to use that closing price from that peak value. Otherwise, you're going to just carry forward the value from whenever the last peak was. Maybe the last peak was 3 bars ago, but you would carry this forward each time, saying, okay, it's not a new peak, but so we're not going to use this number, but we will go back and carry this number forward in a recursive fashion. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to plot this, and we're going to format the plot a little bit. So you cannot, again, you cannot plot a recursive statement. You can define it and then plot that out later, but you cannot plot it immediately. So you cannot make this a plot statement here. You have to come down and say plot LP, for last peak, of course, equals if last peak does not equal 0, then last peak minus 1, else double none. So it's looking forward now, because remember, this was offset up here, looking forward, and so to make this line up, you have to make this offset 1 to the right, else null. Now we're going to use our study color, which can be set by the user by changing these RGB numbers. We're going to make it a horizontal painting strategy. We're going to set the line weight to 2. We're going to hide the title up above because we don't want a whole lot of things up in that top line, and we'll talk about that when we actually look at this. And then we're going to hide the bubble over to the side. So let's see how we're doing with this so far. I'm going to select OK. OK. Now you can see that there are lines here that have been established. I believe that's a drawn line. Let's take that off. Yeah. So you can see that these lines are all corresponding to peaks. So right here, you can see that there is a peak down below on the near term line, that blue line down below. And each of these correspond to one of those peaks. So now we're going to have to go in and do the same thing on the troughs. And I'm going to bring this over. It's basically very similar to what we've done on the peaks, but just looking a little bit differently. We're looking at the near term being less than 80. We're making sure that the current near term value on this candle is less than the prior and less than the following candle. And if so, then we get the close and we get a trough value. Then, similar to how we did above, we either set that trough value if it's a new trough that has just occurred, or if there's not a trough that has just occurred, we carry forward the prior value of last trough. Then again, we plot out the last trough. We set up our formatting. So let's look at that. So now you can see we have both of these plotted out over time. Now, you could say, well, you do those different colors. There are a lot of ways you could define which was top and which was bottom. I know that they're all gray right now, but what I think kind of helps us out, and it's good to look at this command anyway, is first of all, we're going to fill this area with a cloud. Now, how this cloud command works is this. You say add cloud. The first parameter is the last trough. The second parameter is the last peak. If the last trough is greater than the last peak, then this color will show. Otherwise, this color will show. Now, we have the same color in both of these, so it doesn't matter too much. But what we're trying to do is have a cloud that appears between these two values. So I'm going to apply that, and let's see what we have now. So now you can see that it sort of makes sense. Your eye naturally sees this range and understands, you just visually can understand where the peak and the trough are. So one other thing, you'll notice that this goes on past, this is kind of what we want. It goes over here in this area past the last candle. And here what I'm going to do is we're going to put bubbles that identify those levels. So I'll come down here, and this will be the last thing we do on this chart, or on this study, excuse me. So add chart bubble, and what this says is, this is for placement. This first part is for what bar do I place this on. That's what everything up to this first comma is. The next item is, what level do I put this at? Then what do I put in the bubble, the color of the bubble, and then where does this get placed? Up above that price or below that price? So add chart bubble if close is not a number. So you want to make sure you're not putting your bubbles over on top of your price action. You don't want to get in the way of your price action. And then you say, and is nan close 1. So if the current value is not a number and the prior value was not a number, but 2 bars ago it was a number, then you want to print these values. And this logic is the same for both. Let's apply that and see what we have. And now we have our bubble showing up here. And that's the study. So I hope that was helpful somewhat in how to reference other studies. And also we discussed the cloud command a little bit. And hopefully just helps a little bit to familiarize you with how ThinkScript works. Thank you very much.